When I think about retirement investing, I think of Pep Guardiola. Now, if you're not a football fan, don't worry. Basically, Pep is probably the best in the world at what he does, and it's difficult to deny that as a coach and manager, he's nothing short of a genius. The problem when somebody like Pep comes along is that every coach and his dog then wants to copy him, even though they usually haven't got anywhere near the same tactical nous and quality of player, let alone the budget. There have been more new terminologies introduced to football over the last 15 years than ever.
That's why I love to overthink and create stupid tactics.
But despite these newly created positions, philosophies and interchanging formations, football is still a very simple game.
Brian Clough gave me an instruction before my debut for Forest. He went, make sure you pass to one of your own teammates.
The aim is still to stick the ball in the net at least one more time than your opponents. Just like the aim of investing in retirement is still to make sure that you don't run out of money. In football, different players have different roles. Some are attackers and some are defenders. The mistake that a lot of people make with investing in retirement is thinking that all assets have the same role. They don't. And in today's video, I'll explain why that is crucial. I'll also tell you the simple way to work out how much you should hold in different types of investments, what other assets can complement the stocks in your portfolio, and are there better things than bonds to reduce your portfolio risk? By the end of the video, you'll understand how to increase your income potential, protect your capital more, and never worry about your retirement income again. Now, the information I'm giving you here is relevant if you're looking for a flexible withdrawal strategy in retirement. So whether that be from money purchase pension pots, ISAs, general investment accounts, or any combination of those things, this should be useful. I know some people will say, well, if you don't want to worry about income again in retirement, just buy an annuity. And while that's an option, it's not for everyone. This is for people who want more flexibility and control. So there's a term we use a lot in financial planning called capacity for loss or capacity for risk, which we use to work out what is an appropriate amount of money for clients to hold in different types of investments. It's very closely related to attitude to risk, but they're different things. You can have a high attitude to risk, which is your general willingness to accept it, and a low capacity, which is your ability to withstand losses. And of course, the reverse is also true. Generally speaking, if we think about the two main assets in most people's investment portfolios, which are stocks and bonds, your capacity for risk will drive how much you should hold in each of them. The higher your capacity, the more you can hold in stocks, and the lower your capacity, the more you tend to hold in bonds. If you have a high capacity to withstand big swings in value, you can invest as much as you like in stocks. Whether you do or not comes back to your attitude to risk. Am I happy with those fluctuations or not? If you have a low capacity, then it's not appropriate to invest all of your money in stocks. You're too reliant on the capital and probably can't afford to see a 40 to 50% fall in value. You need something that won't fall as much as that. And that asset has historically been bonds. It can be other things, but I'll go into that more later. Now, to calculate your own capacity for loss, it helps to have the tools to do it properly rather than guessing. For that, you'll need to use a cash flow modelling system. And I've put a link below that tells you how you can access the one I use. Personally though, although it's not a recommendation, I generally wouldn't suggest having less than 40% invested in stocks in retirement. The reason is simply potential for returns. You need the engine that stocks provide. And this leads on neatly to another concept I talk a lot about with my clients. Remember when I said earlier that football players have different roles in the team? Not every player's main job is to score goals. Some of them are there to stop you conceding them. And it doesn't matter how good your team is or how expensive it was to assemble, that will always be true. You can think of your retirement portfolio in the same way. If you just had a team of attackers, i.e. stocks, you'd have to accept probably getting smashed 8-1 every now and again. Just like you'd have to accept your investments potentially falling 40-50% in value. So if you imagine having a £1 million portfolio, all invested in stocks that you're taking 40k a year from, it would feel pretty nice and comfortable. But when it falls to 600 grand and you're still taking 40k, it would feel far less comfortable. The return needed to keep your capital value the same has just gone up from 4% a year to 6.66%. If that happened, would you be willing to stick it out for as long as it takes to recover and keep taking the same income? Sure, you'd know that on average, markets take about 2 years to bounce back after a crash. The problem is, averages mean nothing during a one-off event. Very few people would take no action at all during those times. At the very least, they'd probably reduce their withdrawals and see a drop in their standard of living. I know this because I've seen it happen many times. High credit quality bonds, on the other hand, like UK and US government bonds, are your defenders, and they simply won't fall as much. So if you had a more balanced portfolio, you might find it falls to 800k rather than 600, and that's a big difference. It could mean that you're less likely to reduce your withdrawals because it still feels like you've got enough capital to pay the same amount out. And this is what's called utility of assets. They're there to perform different functions, like different positions on a football pitch. Don't make the mistake of thinking that it's just about growth potential in retirement. The benefit of lower risk assets is more around the psychology of loss. Feeling more protected and actually experiencing that protection will influence your behaviour and decisions. But are bonds really the best asset to reduce your risk in retirement? And what are the alternatives? Well, the one I probably get asked about the most is gold.
Gold!
Pretty much every video attracts at least a couple of comments about how great gold is, or asking me what I think of it. My opinion is that if you're looking for an asset to diversify your stock holdings, there are three key criteria: yield, liquidity, and correlation. Or more specifically, low correlation. So when stocks are falling, does the other asset fall by less, or even go in the opposite direction to protect your money? Now, straight away, we know that gold doesn't produce any kind of yield. So whereas bonds pay interest and stocks pay dividends, the only return you get on gold is if its price increases. But can we look past that? Well, its liquidity is good because it's traded on a lot of active markets and it's always in demand, so no problems there. The main attraction, though, is this low correlation, how it protects the value of your money when stocks are falling. This shows a comparison of gold prices, measured by the Bloomberg Gold Subindex in blue, and global stocks, measured by the MSCI World Index in red, over the past 20 years. The first thing to say is that you wouldn't have been disappointed with either of them. If you'd held them for that length of time, they've both delivered a return of well over 600%. The second thing is that the journeys have been quite different. Gold has provided protection at certain times when stocks have fallen, and it's been on a fantastic run over the last 4 years, hence the comments I receive. The problem is when you zoom in a little bit. This is the same two indexes, just showing performance over a different period within that 20 years, the start of 2010 to the start of 2016. A lot of people started to notice how well gold was doing as we emerged from the global financial crisis and wanted to start buying it. The problem was that, in many cases, they only switched on to that around here. If they bought at the peak and continued to hold for the next 4.5 years, their investment lost about 70% of its value. To compound that misery, the gold wasn't even producing any kind of yield to cushion the falls. All it did was just wipe out the great performance of stocks during that time. What actually happened was that most people abandoned ship halfway through, but that underlines the problem you can have with gold. It's volatile. Although it does often do well when stocks fall, it can also do very badly when stocks rise. I've shown before that bonds with strong defensive traits, like UK gilts and US treasuries, will protect you during stock market crashes. We can see this here during the global financial crisis, where their values rose during the sell-off, and again during the very outset of COVID. They're safe haven assets, so the demand for them when people are selling their shares and looking for a safer place to put their money pushes their value up. It's not true of all bonds because those of lower credit quality will behave more like shares during those times. So it's about ensuring you have the right types of bonds in your portfolio. Now, as humans, we have what are called cognitive biases, which are like brain shortcuts to help us process large amounts of information. They're generally very useful, but sometimes they're unhelpful, and one of them is called recency bias. Our brains favour recent events over historic ones, and bonds had a very bad year in 2022, their worst in over 4 decades. There were specific reasons for this, but it also happened to coincide with stocks having a bad year. So bonds just didn't do their job very well. Gold, on the other hand, has done well recently. Therefore, in many people's minds, gold is better than bonds. We can see the dangers of recency bias, though, from the performance chart I showed earlier. I've talked about the reasons why bonds had a bad year in other videos, But basically it was due to sharp, faster than expected interest rate rises, which are bad for bond prices. However, the important thing to remember is this. Interest rates being higher is good for bonds in the long term. That's because, as this shows, 90% of a bond fund's return over the long term is from interest being reinvested, not from the price of bonds going up. Bonds pay guaranteed interest, and higher interest rates mean higher yields on any new bonds bought. So hopefully that explains the main purpose of bonds. I still believe that if your goal is income, the primary assets you hold should be able to produce it. And if you want to reduce the volatility that stocks bring to your portfolio, you should choose an asset that has lower volatility than stocks. That's why I believe high quality bonds are still the best diversifier. However, that's not to say gold shouldn't have a place in your portfolio. Every asset has its merits, and gold has demonstrated its value over long periods of time, particularly as a hedge against inflation and general global uncertainty, which we've had a lot of recently. But because the one thing we can never be certain of is timing, and we can only see performance with hindsight, it's a smaller hold that I think fits into this 5% box. And this box isn't just for gold either. It's any asset that can provide good returns independently of how the main stock markets perform. It could include things like property, or it might be unlisted shares in things like venture capital trusts and enterprise investment schemes. It may even be private collections of things like wine or art. They're all things that can provide growth, as well as maybe a bit of excitement and interest, but they don't have the characteristics to be core income-producing assets in a passive portfolio. They're the 5% club. Now there's another asset we haven't talked about yet. Some people don't actually call it an asset, but I do. In many ways, it's more secure than the bonds you hold, because its value will never be affected by the way stocks move. In that sense, it's completely uncorrelated. And many people ask, well, why don't I just use this instead of bonds? Which is a good question, but it does have a good answer. I'm talking, of course, about cash, the most liquid thing you can hold. The thing that everything else has to be converted into first before you can buy anything. Some people do ignore bonds and use cash as the defensive part of their portfolio, but that comes with some problems, which I'll explain. The best interest rates you can get on fixed rate accounts at the bank will be broadly similar to the best rates on the most secure types of bonds, like gilts. Let's say this rate is 4% and you've got £100,000 invested. The yield you'll get is £4,000 a year. So if you just took that natural income of £4,000, your capital would remain valued at £100,000. Now let's assume interest rates have fallen while you've had your money in that fixed rate account. And when it matures, the best you can get is 2%. That means that the yield on your cash will now only be £2,000 a year. Rates on bonds will also fall, so any new bonds will probably yield about the same. But the difference is that because bonds are traded securities, the value of your existing ones will have risen when rates fell. So your £100,000 might now be worth £110,000. The problem you're faced with here is that you still need £4,000, so you've got no choice but to eat into that capital at the bank and take that down to £98,000, which also means that your interest the following year isn't £2,000 anymore. It's £1,960. If rates stay low, you'll find you're eating into the capital more, and the return you get keeps reducing. In the bond fund, though, you can sell down some of the gains you've made and still not eat into the original investment. So with cash, this is what's called reinvestment risk. Bonds aren't exposed to that because they'll produce growth when interest rates fall. Now it can go the other way, of course, where bond prices fall, but most funds will produce a capital return over time. And like I showed earlier, most of your growth will come from excess reinvested yield anyway. The main reason for holding cash, though, is to take your withdrawals from it when investment conditions become dicey. You can switch to taking withdrawals from cash at any time, and that will allow your other assets the chance to settle rather than selling any of them while they're falling in value. 5% or 2 years' worth of withdrawals, whichever is higher, is a good rule of thumb to provide a cushion. You can tweak the allocation to stocks and bonds depending on your capacity for loss, as mentioned earlier. But this composition provides the basis of an all-weather portfolio for retirement. So now you understand how to construct your portfolio. But another big problem you're going to face in retirement is how to safely increase your withdrawals every year to combat inflation. Fortunately, there's another tried and tested system for you to be able to do that, which is fully explained in the video you can see on screen now. I'll see you there.
England will be playing 4-4-2.